Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be at this conference and to know it's not the first one happening in Latvia to deal with the issue of psychedelics. I should say I am currently in Iceland, where I just attended a 2-day conference on psychedelics here, and where there is growing interest and actually knowledge among senior people and the prospect of Iceland potentially leaping forward, tiny as it is, to become a leader globally in this area. Won't happen tomorrow. But it raises the question of whether Latvia, with 5 times the population, but with independent-minded people, might, play some similar role in years to come. I also want to say it's an honor to be sharing this not just with distinguished people from Latvia, but also with Wim van den Brink from the Netherlands, who I first met 30 years ago when he was leading the research studies on prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to people who had been addicted to street heroin, and who more recently led the Dutch overview of the studies on MDMA, as well as David Nutt, who was an incredibly courageous former head of drug policy in the United Kingdom, and maybe the single most broadly knowledgeable person in the world about psychoactive substances. And of course, Rick Strausman, who was literally the pioneer of psychedelic research in the United States going back 30 years now, and really helped open up this whole field of scientists from different disciplines studying the potential medical and health benefits of psychedelics. So it's an honor to share this with all of them. Now, as you said before, the question is a complicated one and a long one. And I thought that what might be most helpful, and since my experience has covered more or less the full spectrum of illicit psychoactive drugs and drug policies involving them, both in my own country, the United States, as well as globally, this issue of societal stigma. I mean, we know stigma to mean a kind of sometimes appropriate, sometimes inappropriate prejudice or feeling, a negative feeling about certain types of people, certain types of behavior. It can attach to stigma involving just simple things around table manners or how one acts in public. It can involve things about how one presents oneself. It can involve things that also include which drugs one uses and how one uses those things. And stigma is sometimes attached to people's behavior that may be actively offensive to other people. But sometimes stigma is just associated towards nothing to do with behavior, just about a person, their color, their ethnicity, their accent, their size, their physical appearance, or perhaps the food or psychoactive substance that they take into their body, right? And so the question here is, when we look at the issues of stigma in drug policy and psychedelics more broadly, what has driven that, and what is distinctive about psychedelics as opposed to other psychoactive substances that might help it to break free from some of the stigma associated with other currently illicit drugs. Now, if you ask what drives stigma, and I think this can be true both of psychedelics and more broadly, I mean, the first one I probably have to say is just simple fear. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of things that are sometimes demonized in the media. It's fear about our children and what happens if our children were to get access to these things. And sometimes that fear about our children is maybe a displaced form of fear about ourselves and our own vulnerabilities. So I think fear is an overwhelming factor in looking at why we see stigma against different populations and different types of behavior. Now, there's the fear of alteration of consciousness. What does it mean to take a substance, in this case a psychedelic, that alters your consciousness really quite sometimes dramatically, that may even be life-changing, but that also for some people can be horrifying and in a very tiny percentage of people can actually lead to some much longer extended period of time of not being right, of being harmed, of having an underlying mental illness triggered, of things like that. But a lot of it is this fear of alteration of consciousness, and that attaches to also to the idea of control and loss of control. You know, some people say, I hate to lose control, I hate to lose control, and they fear, and that fear of their own loss of control becomes projected onto others as well. You know, it's that fear of what does it mean to alter your consciousness in a way, and especially to alter your consciousness in a way that is unfamiliar. So we may accept the alteration of consciousness in many societies that goes with alcohol, both with mild inebriation, and even in many cases with more substantial inebriation, where some societies are just comfortable. I mean, you know, look at parts of Northern Europe, which were very comfortable in the notion of people drinking large amounts of vodka and getting drunk, and you find a way to try to limit the damage associated with that, but accept that it is part of the local culture. But that fear of loss of control, that fear of a transformation of what one seems as one's normal consciousness, you know, it is indeed a great fear. I mean, people, you know, Andrew Weil, who is been a great thinker, you know, a person who wrote some path-breaking books back 50 years ago called The Natural Mind, about why people use drugs, and the book Chocolate to Morphine, perhaps the best drug education book ever published. And he pointed out that there is no alteration of consciousness that we can accomplish with psychoactive drugs that cannot also be accomplished without psychoactive drugs. Right? There's anything from hallucinations to all sorts of spiritual feeling, to feelings of inebriation, to relaxation. All of these things can be accomplished without drugs. But the fact is that psychoactive drugs, for better or for worse, facilitate and ease that transformation of consciousness. That one can achieve with psychedelics what it might take many days of fasting or meditating or holotropic breathing or other things to accomplish. That one can achieve with say, cannabis, the element of relaxation and modest detachment that takes, you know, a fair degree of control to attain without the use of psychoactive substances. So there's a sense that the alterations of consciousness are really part of who we are as human beings. We all alter our consciousness to one extent or another. We all enter dream states when we're sleeping. People who run may get the runner's high. People who engage in meditation. People who engage in prayer to a Christian or Jewish or Muslim god, may attain some element of alteration of consciousness. But that feeling that these drugs are somehow alien to that, and the notion, in fact, that maybe these drugs might actually help or open up people to the sorts of spiritual awakenings that we associate oftentimes with religion or with modern practices that are not part of the traditional religion, that just seem scary and different. There also, of course, is the fear associated with addiction, that we know that scientifically that the vast majority of substances can be used by the vast majority of people in relatively responsible and modest ways. But we also know that every substance, when used by the wrong people or when used in extreme amounts, can in fact, or because people's susceptibilities are such, that can be addictive. We know that opioids, you know, from opium going back thousands of years, has been a pivotal, you know, way of relieving pain. But we also know the harms that can be associated with opioids. We know that the stimulants can help, you know, whether it's caffeine or things from cocaine or amphetamine. We know that these things can help people stay awake and perform at a higher level of functioning than they would if they were tired. But we also know that some people can use them too much and begin to get into an addictive and problematic relationship with them. Right? We know even with psychedelics that some people can use these things and use them in reckless situations or begin to use them too often. Although the fear of addiction, of course, makes very little sense with respect to psychedelics, because the nature of the psychedelic experience is such that it takes an immense, tremendous drive toward addiction in order to become addicted to psychedelics. I mean, one barely hears about it. Now, with ketamine, slightly different story, and occasionally with MDMA, but with the things like psilocybin and mescaline and LSD and ibogaine and others, one doesn't really see that applying there. Now, there's another element of the fear, and the fear of a sort of competition. Competition, I mean, sometimes it's simple, crass, market elements around competition over markets. We now have the United States as the cannabis market grows, and we see in some states now that people in their 20s or 30s are more likely to use cannabis than alcohol, and we see the market for beer and other liquor declining while the market for cannabis increases. We see some competitive instincts at play in the alcohol world vis-a-vis cannabis, with them trying to figure out whether they can turn this around or whether they should try to co-opt it in some way, right? We see it also, though, in terms of, for example, religious leaders who fear that the psychedelic might take you away from God. It might be a competition. It might cause you to believe in something alien or antithetical to the religious tradition of which you may have grown up in. But there's another variable, and that is ideology. Ideology that says these substances are bad, are evil. I think, for example, a primary example of that is if you look at the narcology, the narcologists in formerly the Soviet Union and now Russia, for whom methadone is a demonized, stigmatized substance for which one can be arrested for prescribing it to a heroin addict. Now we know that methadone and now buprenorphine have been for 50, 60 years, when administered correctly, the most effective way of helping people get past an addiction to street heroin. We know the WHO, the World Health Organization, has endorsed it. We know that the science is there through thousands of studies all around the world and people's lived experiences. But nonetheless, we have an ideology in Russia that says methadone must be prohibited. There was a time in East Asia where, because of its terrible history with the opium wars with Britain in the mid-19th century, that opium and all opioids were to some extent demonized and stigmatized. And although that has now evolved in some ways. And now we are seeing an interesting phenomenon whereby the understandable effort, global effort, to reduce the harms associated with cigarette smoking around the world, have now, which were driven very much by public health considerations and highly legitimate and important. But we now see a part of that tobacco control establishment that has adapted not an anti-smoking mission, but an anti-nicotine ideology, such that when you see new products emerging, whether they're the e-cigarettes or the heat-not-burn devices like IQOS, or the nicotine pouches, or the snus that one sees emerge from Sweden and now has in Norway, and where you see the overwhelming majority of the science showing that these nicotine delivery systems that provide nicotine into the human body, but without the harms of the combusted tobacco, which cause the vast majority of the harms, right? The evidence is overwhelmingly showing that these things are helpful in terms of enabling smokers to quit, either reduce or to quit smoking, and that the harms associated with extended use are maybe 5 or 10% of the harms associated with smoking cigarettes. Yet this anti-nicotine ideology has become so dominant, certainly in my country and a number of others, that we are essentially banning the harm reduction approaches to tobacco and nicotine while continuing to facilitate and allow the sale of the most dangerous products, of smoked cigarettes. It would almost be as if we were going to ban methadone while the government endorsed the legal use of adulterated heroin on the streets. But that's about ideology as well. And then there's the final element of fear here, which is the element that oftentimes what distinguishes why certain drugs are criminalized and others not, when you dig deep into the scientific evidence, into the historical evidence, what one finds is that the decision of different societies to criminalize some psychoactive substances and not others has relatively little to do with the relative risks of those substances, and far more to do with who uses and who is perceived to use those substances. I mean, to give you an example, in my country, in the mid-19th or later 19th century, the principal users of opioids for decades were middle-aged white women who used it to deal with everything from aches and pains to diarrhea and constipation to menopause to you name it. And nobody thought to criminalize it, even though some women became addicted to it, because nobody wanted to put their middle-aged or elderly white grandma or auntie behind bars. But when Chinese migrants began to come to my country in the 1870s and 80s, working hard on the railroads and the mines and the factories, and who would relax in the evening not by having a drink, as other white Americans did, but by smoking a little opium, that's when you began to have the fears. And the first opium prohibition laws in my country were in Nevada, the states of Nevada and California, directed at Chinese minorities. To some extent, the cannabis prohibition laws, in the United States, especially in the Southwest, were driven by prejudice and stigma against Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants. To some extent, with blacks, the criminalization of cocaine. Cocaine had been, in Coca-Cola till 1900. It had been something used fairly extensively, and the harms were not that great. But when it became identified with black men in the South using cocaine, that's when one saw the first cocaine prohibition laws in the South, with the media portraying all of these things as dangerous. And whether it was Chinese or Mexicans or blacks, it was also about the fear of what would these people under the influence of drugs do to other people, including especially our precious white women. Even in the United States, the prohibition of alcohol 100 years ago was to some extent a similar sort of conflict. A conflict between the white Americans who had come from Northern Europe and Western Europe to America in the 1700s and 1800s, and the not so white Americans who came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, and all the fears around mass immigration that we now, similar to what we now see happening in the United States today, right? It was the association of those people and their alcohol use that led to the prohibition of alcohol throughout this society. Now, I look, for example, it's interesting also to think about, the countries that experienced alcohol prohibition. It was not my country, it was parts of Canada, and then it was really, Scandinavia, Russia. These were the other countries that went to either partial or full alcohol prohibition 100 years ago. I mean, really, any place where the sun tends to shine for 22 hours of the day at some times of year, and to barely ever shine for 22 hours other times of the year, where people developed very destructive relationships with alcohol and developed tremendous fears with them. And I think that some of the fears, especially perhaps in the Baltics and throughout this northern part of Europe, regarding cannabis, I say, and certainly with psychedelics, is once again a fear, a cultural fear that maybe has its origins in the traumatic experience with alcohol going back historically in these parts of the world. It's interesting when you look around Northern Europe that you see many of the countries moving quite quickly, or have moved in recent decades, to embrace harm reduction with respect to heroin use and injecting drug use, and being very pragmatic and science-based about this. But when it comes to cannabis reform, notwithstanding the dramatic movement around the world for the legalization and regulation of cannabis, and the great dramatic expansion around the medical uses of cannabis, and the understanding that the large majority of non-medical use of cannabis or quasi-medical use of cannabis is not all that dangerous. I mean, cannabis, of course, does have its great harms for some people, but nonetheless, in this part of the world, it feels as if that trauma around alcohol has sort of been displaced or carried over onto cannabis, which explains the bizarre fact of repressive cannabis policies and even prohibitions on medical cannabis, even now. So, to bring us now specifically to psychedelics, if you look at the original stigma, I mean, a lot of that, you had, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, we had this, hundreds of research studies around the benefits of psychedelics. The book Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered by Lester Grinspoon and James Bacalar was an excellent overview of the research back then. So there was a lot of the studies that we're seeing today, many of those had their antecedents back in the 50s and 60s, sometimes even supported, many of them supported by the federal government and sometimes even by our intelligence agencies for both, upstanding as well as not very upstanding purposes, right? Then, of course, it was the way that LSD especially took off in the broader culture. Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor turned guru, turn on, drop in, and or turn on, tune in, turn on, tune in, and drop out thing, the association with hippies that basically turned sort of portrayed something that had been seen in the 1950s and 60s as a fascinating area of potential psychiatric treatment. It flipped it around to this massive hippie drug use. And President Nixon took advantage of that to ban those substances, right? And then we went into more or less the dark ages, both in the US and around the world, with virtually no psychedelics research. All of these drugs regarded as Schedule 1, entirely prohibited substances, right? People being arrested, no government support for research. I mean, with rare exceptions, right? These sort of dark ages. And then we began to see, first with the work of Rick Straussman and a few others in the 1990s, and then with the additional work coming out of Johns Hopkins University and New York University, looking at the impact of psychedelics on people who were nearing death or going through something like that experience. And then simultaneously, the work of Rick Doblin and MAPS, his organization MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And Rick made it his mission to try to get government approval for MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, for treating PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Now, I mean, that was a monumental effort on the part of MAPS. And I should say also, MDMA, not regarded as a psychedelic. It doesn't cause that type of alteration of consciousness. It's more of an empathogen, something that opens the heart and enables one both to hear better, to reflect better, to speak better about deep-seated emotional issues. So you now have the advantage that we now have the emergence of psychedelics research, still unfortunately largely funded through private contributions, philanthropic, and even more so now private investments, which will distort the market in ways that may not be beneficial, but billions of dollars coming into the study of these substances to deal with PTSD, to deal with the fear of dying, to deal with anxiety, and to deal with depression, and to deal potentially with pain, to deal with eating disorders, anorexia, to deal with a host of difficult psychiatric conditions. And even now, when one looks at the research of Gould Dolan, G-U-L Dolan, D-O-L-E-N, about the critical learning period, raising the possibility that substances, and perhaps most especially ibogaine, which is the longest acting of them, may actually help in dealing with not just psychiatric challenges, but even with physical conditions, ranging from stuttering to recovering from a stroke or other injuries by resetting that critical learning period. And where you now have animal studies showing evidence about why this, in fact, might be successful. So the fact now that you have psychedelic research institutes at Harvard University, they have 3 of them, in fact, at Yale and Columbia and New York University, and I believe at Cornell at Johns Hopkins, at University of California in Berkeley, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles, but also in Texas and in Alabama, University of Alabama, University of Florida, and University College in London and Imperial College in London, and places in Switzerland and Europe and Switzerland and even in Norway today and in Brazil. The fact that you have major university institutions studying this and taking it as a serious, legitimate subject of study is having a very, very positive contribution to reducing the stigma associated with these things, right? It's also the fact that there was a book. Sometimes a book can make all the difference in the world. And when Michael Pollan's book, Pollan, when his book came out about, 7, 8, 9 years ago, I mean, because Michael Pollan already had a global reputation for writing in thoughtful and responsible ways about diet and food and agriculture, he already had a mass audience of people who were not interested in psychedelics, but who read about it because they respected Michael Pollan. And his writing also hugely opened this up in a major, major way. Now, one of my great frustrations
could you please allow us to ask you some questions?
Okay.
Yeah,
let me just make
because
the last
you have
comment,
still
which I
2
do
minutes
think is
time.
important.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I will stop now. Go ahead. Let's take the question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this excellent emotional speech. And we have a few minutes for 1 or 2 questions.
I'm at Southern University of Latvia. May I refer to the first part of your talk, when you spoke about fear from psychedelics and drugs which alter people's mind. May I ask your opinion about the following kind of attitude? When people are doing meditation or doing, I don't know, religious prayer, sometimes it's kind of experimentation with mind, experimentation with consciousness, and kind of deliberate experimentation with what people can do with their own minds. When we are doing this by help of chemical substances, maybe may I call it this way? When we are doing this with help of chemical substances, can it be considered as simply shortcut? Because people are nowadays busy, they don't want to take time, they don't want to invest effort, and simply trying to do it in simple and fast way.
Yes, well,
what you're telling about that?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said before, that it is that psychedelics, and as I said, for better and for worse, become the quicker and easier way. They are the shortcut. And oftentimes, shortcuts are the smart thing to do and the wise thing to do. Why go the long way or the difficult way or the way that nobody will go when we have the quicker and easier way to do it? Other times, they're the irresponsible thing to do, where one should do the work and the discipline to get to that place. But we know now, I mean, based upon huge amounts of both case studies, personal reports, and now the research, that in fact, people who might not ever have gotten to healing through other sorts of spiritual means or meditative means are finding that type of healing by using these substances in a responsible way. So I think the quick answer is that yes, these are shortcuts, and that is overwhelmingly a good thing.